thoughts on what is peace and what does it mean to you. And before I hand this question over to our presenters, talk a little bit about this concept of negative peace versus positive peace, which some of you may have been introduced to in any classes you've taken on conflict resolution or peace building. And negative peace is essentially the absence of violence, versus positive peace is being the presence of structures and systems that support justice, tolerance, and peaceful coexistence. So it's more than just the absence of violence. It's actually the presence of structures, institutions, and policies that support peaceful coexistence. And these different views of peace, thinking about what you shared in your small groups, you may have a more negative or positive view of it, but these views of peace impact the kinds of education and training programs that various organizations implement. For example, one program might involve training police and security forces. One might involve reintegration of child soldiers into the general population, and another might involve education around human rights and how people demand, protect, and advance them. So my question to our panelists is, in your experience as educators, how have the learners and communities in which you've worked, how have they viewed this concept of peace? What kinds of peace or peace education has your work sought to build? And in what types of violence or conflict has your educational work sought to address? Saji, can you begin with you?
The easy question,
Yeah, very easy.
It's a really difficult question, and I see it in so many different layers. So if I can take a minute to see from my own perspective, growing up in Sri Lanka at the time of the war, to me, peace was ending the bloodshed and making sure people are not starving or being seen murdered in front of me or being burnt alive. To me, that was peace at the time. As I grew older and the war kind of took a different turn, peace was a different thing. Peace was about having the opportunity to go to school, having the opportunity to have the infrastructures available so I don't trample on landmines or the bus doesn't explode when I get into the bus to go to school. And later on, it's about having that sense of mindset for me. It's about having people who are humble enough to recognize that it's a conscious decision we make to make sure we are on a daily basis, we are practicing peaceful existence and coexistence. That's from a thought process to action process. Now, when I see that in the people we work with, from Search for Common Ground, which is a large international peace-building organization, it's one of the oldest organizations around peace-building, we engage with young people and adults to try to look at societal transformation. And in that context, I can tell you from working with young people, peace is also a very layered area. In Nigeria, in the southern region of Nigeria, in Port Harcourt, and in Jos in the north, last month when I was there, in the street children, for them peace was about living in violence. That was a different peace for them, because that's the normalcy they knew. Women being raped was not a violent activity. It was a protection mechanism for them to survive on the streets. For them, that was their peace. But that's a small portion of a larger population who also say, for us, peace is about having the infrastructures, having the resources, having the opportunity to make a decent living. That was also peace for them. But in the context of the other piece of that whole concept of peace is also as outsiders going into places, how do we interact with local populations, making sure that our footprints are not big enough when we leave. And that also, because it creates a lot of tensions within local populations. So that is another level I wanted to bring out, because we are all internationals. Eventually we will go somewhere else, and I want to make sure that when we go, our footprints don't leave large footprints behind.
Well, in my work, when I think of peace in the real world, and I also think of peace online. So with regards to the real world, at the Inter-American Development Bank, we have a fairly integrated approach toward violence and the role that peace plays in education. I think initially it started off as an educational issue. We noticed that there's a large dropout rate in many countries, and we noticed that there's lots of unemployed males, especially like young males who are unemployed. And it's very much a cyclical issue when it comes to peace and education. Peace lack of peace inhibits education from happening, especially in primary school and secondary school. But at the same time, without education, you have more unemployed youth, and then you have more openness to have a violent society or lack of peace. So, at least at the Inter-American Development Bank, we have a fairly integrated approach now that uses the whole social sector, whereas peace and peace education, it's not just an education issue, but it has to do with youth at risk, it has to do with violence, it has to do with a much broader social issue. So, so that's one point when I think of peace in the real world and how it relates to education. And secondly, peace online is something that is, it's certainly becoming a big issue in highly connected countries, but we talk a lot in my line of work about 21st century skills and what kinds of skills you need in the 21st century, and we talk about digital citizenship as much as we talk about regular citizenship. So, you know, achieving peace on online communities and on the internet, I think, is becoming more and more important as that difference between the real world and online become more fused. And we see this in developing countries as well, where there is internet penetration. We do have this this issue, and it's becoming an increasingly large problem.
Okay, so I think at some level, violence on a personal level is fairly easy for us to conceive. We understand the notion of revenge and the notion of forgiveness. But Darren, you mentioned structural violence, and that was certainly a strain that you both touched on as well. This notion that there's a larger structure at play, that people can be contributing to violence without knowing they're contributing to violence. I think oftentimes the metaphor of like, there's a fraudulent charge on your credit card and you call the bank and it's not their problem, it's the credit card company, but then there's like 6 other players that you've got to talk to, and like every part of the process is guilty in some way, but there's no accountability. And I think in a sense that's what we're up against when we think about structural violence, is that there are entire systems out there that are oppressing, and so the work of peace then becomes even more complex and challenging. How do we address these things individually and then in some? And one of the projects that Darren and I spent a lot of time working on was a project called DC Peace. We were working with kids, 5-year-olds to 10-year-olds, really young kids here in DC, trying to develop skills for them to be able to communicate in nonviolent ways, sort of a language and a medium to communicate those skills. But beyond that, it was about looking at the school system, looking at the way a classroom is managed, trying to understand how teachers and even just the physicality of a classroom contributes to violence, and how it's important for us to think all these things are interconnected, and one cannot just address one aspect and then expect to have things be peaceful. It really does become a much larger, more structural issue. So that was just one example.
You raised a good question about
Yeah.
like structural violence and the structure of the learning space itself.
Yeah.
Any of you care to give some examples of how a learning space can be structured, or can a learning space be structured that is more conducive to peace building, and what does that look like?
Absolutely, a circle. Usually get too many people in this class for a giant circle, but I think just the notion of being able to break up into small groups to interact. A lecture can be somewhat oppressive for folks, to just sort of being talked at for a long time. So, and definitely there are folks that learn in that way, and that there is a place for lectures in the classroom. But I would say that allowing the classroom space to truly be interactive and engaging and account for as many different learning styles as one can is part and parcel of a peace education approach.
In addition, I think it's about making sure people have the opportunity to speak, even though you may disagree. I might disagree with Nick, but I want to be able to make sure when I speak that he will not yell at me or fight with me or throw a stone across the hallway towards me. So having the circle is one thing, but also having the freedom and the trust to be able to speak openly and to be heard, and making sure people actually listening to what you're saying is the other part of it also, I think, is just creating that safe space for people to trust each other and engage across dividing lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there needs to be a safe environment in the classroom so that even if you say something in class and then across the schoolyard somebody doesn't